If Liandrin were to rise to power as the leader of the Aes Sedai, it would mark one of the most dramatic and dangerous shifts in the history of the White Tower. A member of the Red Ajah and secretly a high-ranking agent of the Black Ajah, Liandrin is known for her cruelty, ambition, and ruthless approach to power. As Amyrlin Seat, Liandrin would wield absolute authority over the White Tower, and her leadership would quickly turn one of the most powerful institutions in the world into an oppressive and terrifying force. She would reshape the tower to serve her own vision, eliminating those who stood against her, and bending the Aes Sedai into tools for her own twisted agenda. This analysis explores how Liandrin would seize power, how she would rule, what changes she would enforce, and ultimately, what consequences her reign would have for the White Tower, the Westlands, and the war against the Shadow. How would Liandrin seize power? Liandrin is not a woman who relies on diplomacy or fairness to achieve her goals. If she were to ascend to the Amyrlin Seat, it would not be through the traditional process of the Hall of the Tower selecting a leader through consensus. She would manipulate, deceive, and, if necessary, eliminate anyone who stood in her way. The most likely way Liandrin could take control of the White Tower would be through subterfuge, political maneuvering, and outright treachery. As a member of the Black Ajah, she already has an underground network of allies who would help her eliminate opposition. She would likely frame, disgrace, or even have powerful Aes Sedai assassinated, removing any who might challenge her rise. Given her cunning nature, she might use a false crisis to rally support, positioning herself as the only Aes Sedai strong enough to bring order to the tower. She could manufacture an external threat, such as an attack on Tar Valon or a supposed betrayal from the Blue or Green Ajahs, giving her justification to take emergency control. Once in power, she would make sure she never let go of it. Her strongest opposition would come from the Blues and Greys, who would see through her deception, as well as the Yellows, who would oppose her harsh methods. However, the Reds, especially those who share her aggressive views, might support her, believing that a strong hand is needed to maintain the White Tower's dominance. If Liandrin were to successfully remove all opposition, she could force her way into the Amyrlin Seat, ruling not through respect and wisdom, but through fear and brutality. The White Tower under Liandrin's rule. If Liandrin were to take control of the White Tower, it would no longer be the center of knowledge and balance in the Westlands. Instead, it would become a fortress of tyranny, manipulation, and cruelty. One of the first things she would do is completely militarize the Aes Sedai, turning them from a loosely governed sisterhood into an iron-fisted ruling class. She would enforce absolute obedience, ensuring that all sisters followed her will without question. Dissent would not be tolerated. Those who opposed her would be publicly punished or even executed to set an example. The novice and accepted training system would become even more brutal. Under Liandrin's leadership, punishment for failure would be severe, and the weakest initiates might even be discarded or turned into servants, rather than being allowed to rise through the ranks. Instead of training Aes Sedai as scholars, healers, and diplomats, she would turn them into instruments of power, trained to enforce her rule. The White Tower's alliances with nations would also shift dramatically. Rather than working through diplomacy, Liandrin would take a more aggressive approach, using the Aes Sedai as enforcers rather than advisors. She would demand loyalty from kings and queens, threatening them with destruction if they refused to submit. Nations that resisted would find themselves facing armies of channelers, ensuring that no ruler could oppose her without dire consequences. One of the most horrifying changes under her rule would be the treatment of male channelers. As a former Red Ajah enforcer, Liandrin already despises men who can channel, but with absolute power, she would take this hatred to an unprecedented level. Rather than simply gentling men who can channel, she might advocate for their total extermination, ensuring that no male channeler was allowed to live. The Reds would become an even more ruthless organization, acting as hunters and executioners who tracked down and eliminated any male who even showed signs of being able to touch Satan. If Rand al'Thor had not already established himself as the Dragon Reborn, she would likely declare war on him, branding him as an enemy of the White Tower, and using all available forces to hunt him down. Even if she recognized that the last battle required the Dragon Reborn, she would likely seek to control or imprison him, ensuring that she remained in power once the battle was won. The Black Ajah's influence. One of the most terrifying aspects of Liandrin's rule would be the increased power of the Black Ajah. As a high-ranking member of this secretive organization, she would undoubtedly use her position as Amyrlin Seat to expand the Shadow's influence within the White Tower, ensuring that Dark Friends and Forsaken agents had free rein to operate without fear of discovery. She would silence any investigation into the Black Ajah, ensuring that loyal Aes Sedai who sought to root out corruption were eliminated before they could act. Instead of being hunted, the Black Ajah would thrive, spreading their influence deeper into the heart of the White Tower. If Liandrin were acting on direct orders from the Forsaken, she could even begin preparing Tar Valon for total submission to the Shadow, subtly aligning the White Tower with the Dark One's forces rather than opposing them. This would be a devastating blow to the forces of light, as it would mean that one of the greatest bastions of civilization had fallen into darkness. The war against male channelers. One of the most terrifying policies Liandrin would enforce would be her absolute extermination of male channelers. Unlike the traditional Red Ajah, which captures men who can channel and gentles them, Liandrin might take this even further, declaring that all male channelers must be executed on sight. With the entire White Tower under her control, she would launch continent-wide purges, sending Red Sisters out into the world to hunt down and slaughter any man who showed signs of touching Satan. This would bring her into direct conflict with Rand al'Thor, the Dragon Reborn. If she gained power before Rand could fully establish himself, she might attempt to capture or kill him before he could fulfill his role in the last battle. Even if she acknowledged that the Dragon Reborn must fight the Dark One, she would likely seek to imprison or control him, ensuring that she remained the true ruler of the world, even after the Shadow was defeated. This policy would also put her at odds with the Ashamen, who would see her as the greatest threat to their existence. The Black Tower, if already established, would become a direct enemy of the White Tower, likely leading to an all-out war between the two factions. This conflict would be devastating, as it would mean that instead of uniting against the Shadow, the two greatest forces of channelers would be fighting each other, weakening their ability to stand against the Dark One. The fate of the rebel Aes Sedai and the future of Tar Valon. Not all Aes Sedai would accept Liandrin's rule. If she rose to power, many sisters from the Blue, Green, and Grey Ajahs would likely rebel, seeking to overthrow her before she could consolidate too much control. This could lead to a split in the White Tower, similar to what happened in the Wheel of Time when Aleda Duavrini Arroyan overthrew Cywin Sanch. This rebellion would likely be led by women such as Egwene Alver, Elaine Trakand, and Nynaeve Almera, who would recognize the threat that Liandrin posed and seek to remove her before it was too late. This could lead to a civil war within the Aes Sedai, with Tar Valon itself becoming a battleground between the forces of oppression and those fighting to restore balance. If Liandrin were allowed to rule unchallenged for too long, the White Tower might become so corrupted that it could no longer be saved. The institution that had once protected humanity for thousands of years could become a weapon of the Shadow, used to crush any opposition and ensure that the Dark One's victory was inevitable. However, Liandrin's own arrogance and cruelty would likely be her downfall. Like many tyrants, she would assume that her power was absolute and unshakable, underestimating the will of those who opposed her. Eventually, she would be overthrown, either by rebellious Aes Sedai, the Dragon Reborn, or even by her own allies within the Black Ajah, who saw her as too much of a liability. Her reign would be short, brutal, and filled with suffering, but in the end, she would not be able to hold on to power forever. The rise of an Aes Sedai dictatorship. Under Liandrin's leadership, the White Tower would no longer function as a guiding force. It would become an empire in its own right. The Aes Sedai have always been politically powerful, influencing rulers and shaping events from behind the scenes. But Liandrin would abolish all pretense of diplomacy. Instead of manipulating through careful maneuvering, she would rule through direct control and fear, enforcing the absolute authority of the White Tower over every nation. This means that the hull of the tower would likely be dismantled or reduced to a puppet body, with Liandrin holding unchecked power. The sitters of each Ajah, once responsible for balancing the Amyrlin's rule, would either swear absolute loyalty to her or be removed, either through exile, execution, or a forced oath rod binding. She would likely declare herself more than just Amyrlin, perhaps even demanding the title of Empress or Supreme Mother, solidifying the idea that the White Tower was no longer just an organization of channelers but the true ruling power of the Westlands. This shift would completely destroy the independence of nations, forcing them to swear loyalty to the Tower or face destruction. Rulers who resisted would be publicly overthrown or assassinated, and their replacements would be chosen by Liandrin herself. Some nations, such as Kergin, Tyr, and Terabon, might accept this rule either out of fear or because their nobility would benefit from aligning with her. Others, such as Andor, Saldaia, and Arafal, would resist fiercely, sparking open war against the White Tower. Over time, the Aes Sedai would likely become more militarized, taking direct control of cities and regions, placing governors and enforcers in every major kingdom. The Tower Guard, originally created to protect Tar Valon, would be expanded into a continent-wide police force, ensuring that no one disobeyed the laws set by Liandrin. What was once a respected, if feared, organization would become a dreaded empire that ruled through an iron fist, making the White Cloak's fears of Aes Sedai tyranny a reality. The fate of other Ajahs. One of the biggest changes under Liandrin's rule would be the destruction of the traditional balance between the Ajahs. As a former Red Ajah enforcer, she would heavily favor the Reds, elevating them to a position of supreme authority, while crushing the influence of other Ajahs. The Blue Ajah, which has historically been the biggest rival to the Reds, would likely be completely purged, its members either exiled, imprisoned, or forced to submit to Red rule. Many of the most powerful and independent-minded Aes Sedai, such as Siuan Sanche, Lean Sharif, and Moiraine de Madrid, would either go into hiding or be executed. The Green Ajah, once known for its warriors who fight against the Shadow, might also be weakened or absorbed into Liandrin's military structure. Any Green Sisters who refused to submit to her rule would likely be hunted down. The Grey Ajah, known for diplomacy and negotiation, would lose all purpose under Liandrin's reign, as she would rule through force rather than political alliances. The Yellow Ajah, focused on healing, might be allowed to continue its work, but only under strict oversight, ensuring that they served only those loyal to the Amyrlin. The Browns, devoted to knowledge and study, might be restricted from certain areas of research, particularly anything related to the history of the Age of Legends or the true nature of the One Power. Liandrin would suppress any knowledge that could be used to challenge her rule, ensuring that history was rewritten to serve her narrative. The Red Ajah, under Liandrin's leadership, would become the dominant force in the White Tower, enforcing its rule through brutality, fear, and absolute authority. The White Tower's alliance with the Forsaken. As a high-ranking member of the Black Ajah, Liandrin would not be acting alone. If she ruled the White Tower, she would likely ally herself with the Forsaken, using their knowledge and power to further solidify her control. This could lead to horrifying possibilities, such as Forsaken openly advising the White Tower, using their ancient knowledge to make Liandrin's rule even more unstoppable. Aes Sedai being forced to swear oaths to the Shadow, ensuring their loyalty under pain of death. The last battle being sabotaged from within, as Liandrin might seek to weaken Rand's forces, ensuring that the Dark One won. If left unchecked, Liandrin's reign could completely doom the world, handing the White Tower over to the Shadow, and ensuring that the Light had no chance of victory. The downfall of Liandrin. Despite her cunning, Liandrin's rule would eventually collapse. The more oppressive and brutal her regime became, the more enemies she would create. A rebellion would almost certainly rise, led by Aes Sedai who refused to submit, male channelers who would not be hunted down, and kingdoms that would not be ruled by fear. Key figures such as Egwene Olvir, Nynaeve Almira, Elaine Trakand, and Rand all four would recognize that Liandrin was as much a threat as the Dark One himself, and they would lead the charge to bring her down. Her rule might last for years, maybe even decades, but in the end, her own cruelty, ambition, and arrogance would be her downfall. The White Tower would eventually be purged of her corruption, but not without great suffering. Her reign would be remembered as one of the darkest periods in Aes Sedai history, a warning of what happens when power is placed in the wrong hands. Final conclusion. If Liandrin became the leader of the Aes Sedai, it would spell disaster for the White Tower, the Westlands, and the fight against the Shadow. Her rule would be defined by cruelty, tyranny, and ruthless oppression, turning the Aes Sedai into an organization of enforcers and executioners rather than protectors and guides. Her downfall would be inevitable, but the damage she could do before that happened would be catastrophic.